Welcome to the TIPNG VoteCast. This is a VoteCast for people interested in elections in Papua New Guinea, where we give you the news behind the news. This podcast is brought to you by the Australia-PNG Partnership with Transparency International Papua New Guinea. My name is Yoambari Highway, the Deputy Director for Partnerships and Policy with Transparency International PNG. In studio today, I'm joined by a special guest from the University of Papua New Guinea. I'll allow him to introduce himself and explain us a bit about his role at the university.
Thanks, Yoambari. My name is Maholopa Laveil. You can call me Maho. I'm a UPNG economics lecturer and also a researcher with the University of Papua New Guinea and the Australian National University with the Development Policy Centre. And yes, it's very good to be here.
Excellent. And how long have you been with the University of Papua New Guinea in this role?
So I've been a lecturer for 3 years, beginning in 2019. I was a tutor back in 2016. So I've been connected to the university for about the last 6 to 7 years.
That's fantastic. And we've invited you on this podcast because you have a lot of insight and experience with the elections. And I think listeners and viewers would have read some of the pieces that you've put out and that we'll be discussing in this episode. What informs your personal research interest in the space of elections in Papua New Guinea? Where is that coming from?
So I didn't really have a specific interest in the elections until the 2018 when I was doing my master's at ANU. In the second semester, we had this qualitative impact and evaluation course, and I was looking for a subject for the major research paper, and the elections database was very rich. I think they had over 20,000 data points, and it was there were a lot of regression tools that were being taught that I could apply it. So I completed a paper on incumbency advantage, so MPs advantage going into their second election, the vote shares they win, the probability of running in the next election, and the probability of winning in the next election. It was a really good paper, and I credit that a lot to my mentors at the Development Policy Centre, particularly Dr. Terence Wood, who helped me a lot with that paper. But that really sparked my interest in the elections, and I've really carried it on from there.
Yeah, I recall that paper coming out. It was really interesting. The turnover rate was about 50% or so at that time in 2018. And some people treat the elections in Papua New Guinea like an elections lotto, and you go in and you see if you can win or not. And if you have a 50% turnover rate as an incumbent, I think that's an interesting research angle. What was the final finding that you found in terms of the paper that you put out?
So I actually didn't publish it. I've been holding it back. We really want to improve it for a journal article. But the findings that were statistically significant. So MPs have about 13% probability of winning in the next election, about an 8% winner vote share, and about I think it was 8% probability of running again. So they were statistically significant. They were replicated from, I think, Indonesia. And if it gets published, then we can replicate the same study in Solomon Islands and Samoa.
Excellent, and thanks for giving us the slight preview to the paper, and we hope it does get released in a journal where the public can consume it. I think just zooming back out from maybe that, and we'll go into maybe the Economist view of how elections are conducted and some of those economic data points that you mentioned. It's very interesting in terms of analyzing and evaluating the conduct of elections. When you look at the elections, what are the processes that are actually involved? We say elections for the whole thing, but what are the components of it?
So as a researcher, when I approach the elections, we really start focusing on the elections from the roll update, how close the roll is aligned to population estimates, particularly because PNG hasn't run a credible census in the last 20 years. And then we go to the voting process. How safe is that? How credible it is? Our integrity of the elections upheld at the voting booth, and then the counting process, and then at the end the election win, and then the composition of the parliament. We pretty much focus on parties as well, the composition of parties, how strong the parties are. Are they still based loosely on personalities? Is it money politics, or is it starting to be more informed? Are voters aware of party ideology, party platforms, party policy? So that's really my entrance into the elections, and then we pretty much go broader to the governance of the whole election process, election integrity globally compared to peer countries and compared to developed countries as well.
And you say to peer countries, and you mentioned the example earlier of Indonesia. And so would you find that these components that you've outlined of an electoral process are applicable to other electoral processes in other countries? Would you say these are the standard components of an election, where you have a roll update, the counting, the going to the polls, the counting, the declaration of results, formation of government, party politics? Or is this only particular to a certain type of country?
I think, well, if we compare it to Indonesia, it's very different. We have a unicameral parliament. Indonesia has a breakup of, I think, regions and then districts, and they all have different. I think it's a bicameral parliament in Indonesia, but a lot of the trends are particularly informative. So trends in voter participation, trends in voter turnout, trends in number of candidates that run, trends in the violence that we experience, whether culture is endemic to us. Particularly, or is it similar in Indonesia? And then a lot of the geography, the culture, the ethnicity. So yeah, there are some things that we can measure across different countries, and there are other things that are particularly unique to PNG.
Excellent, and I think we'll go into that, I think, also in a bit more detail. You mentioned about the academic interest that you've had in elections, and often when we talk about elections in Papua New Guinea, people think of organizations, public organizations like the Ombudsman Commission, the police, the Defense Force, and other actors at the subnational level, like the local governments, provincial governments, I should say. We often don't think of academic institutions like our national universities or research organizations. Where do you see academia playing its role in strengthening the integrity of elections in Papua New Guinea?
So I've seen my role, I've seen the role of my colleagues as being more of a warning sounder. So we've written about the elections. I think Dr. Terence Wood, who is my mentor, wrote about the 1975 to 2012 elections after the 2017 elections, straight after that. And then we published the election review, our election review in 2019. So this was 2 years before the current elections, 3 years, I think. And so we try to warn the government, warn voters about the problems with the elections ahead of time, and raise issues, try to give a more informed view of the elections, try to bring our expertise to, and make it more accessible to people, to ordinary people, so that both the voters, candidates, government can be aware, can have a more informed view of it, and can, at least 2 years, 3 years before the elections, at least try to make changes.
And so ideally for you, you would like to see a government that makes policy decisions based on the research output that comes from these institutions with the aim of strengthening integrity. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, so that's really interesting. The MP for North Fly quoted one of my blogs word for word in Parliament without quoting me. So that was pretty sad. But it was really good to see people actually reading, people actually sharing what we've actually published, and actually holding government to account. I think at that time he was an opposition MP, so it's really good to see him push for more integrity, for the moral to be more credible. Sadly, the government has always acted very late for the roll update, but it's good to see people actually taking what we've written into account.
Are you ever concerned that they might cherry pick what you say and just use certain information for their own interest? And is that a risk that most academia and universities, at large, face, because they're putting out research and it's very neutral research, but in the political arena it can be very easily politicized one way or another? Is that something that you're mindful of?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of our so the conclusions to our findings are used as political clubs. The recommendations are not taken on board, but that's the risk we face. We don't control the consumption of our research papers, but we're happy if they're being read and they're being at least if they're holding government to account. That's what we hope for.
And then we'll put in the show notes for this episode a number of the pieces that you put out, analyzing some of the data that's come out from the research that you mentioned your mentor, Dr. Woods, and others within ANU and in other institutions have put out. And these pieces that you put out have informed public debate, and as you said, have been taken up but by both sides of politics in PNG. When you're talking about this analysis, you're using basic research tools. but you also have very specific data sets that you mentioned and alluded to. Can you talk us through what are some of those data sets that you use in your analysis and how have they been put together? And more importantly, I guess, how can our listeners and viewers also access the same data to see what's being generated and recorded?
So the databases that Development Policy Center has put out are freely accessible. Our primary data source is the elections database. It was compiled by Dr. Terence Wood, goes back to the 1972 elections, was compiled with data from the archives at ANU of the elections data that they had, I think, back to 2002. From 2007 onward, they were cobbled together by through data released by the Electoral Commission and from newspaper sources. It's updated to the 2017 elections. It has, like I said, 20,000 data points. So that's the primary data source. A secondary data source is the MP database, which was released in last month, has all the 111 MPs, their parties, their movements across parties during the 10th Parliament, so 2017 to 2022. And then we have the Economics database, which has, you can find economics data, but related to the elections and politics, for example, GDP per capita, nominal and real GDP. Then you have things like government funding, revenue, expenditure, and also DSIP and DSIP per capita as well. So those are the three main elections sources. And then we've got other global data sets like the Elections Integrity Project, which has, I think, about more than 120 countries that compares countries in terms of election integrity. And the IDEA, I think, Democratic Institution Global, compares the integrity of elections across countries. So those are the 5 data sets that we draw from.
And maybe just to the biggest one that's, I guess, pertinent, the elections database set you mentioned, the 20,000 over...
Yeah, 20,000
data
from
points.
1972.
So what is a data point, just for those that might not be,
Yeah,
economics lectures? What are we talking about here? Is it numbers? Is it individual facts? What is a data point, and what does that look like?
So data point is a specific, it's a point where you can cross check between candidates, their vote shares, the population of the role, and the population of that specific district to province. It goes back to the bio of the candidate, and then there's other sort of variables or indicators for each of the elections. So combined across all those different variables, it gets to 20,000.
And then you can interpret each of those things and how they relate to each other, I guess, to then do your projections or to do the analysis. So you would look at, for instance, data over time. So is this person tracking towards more voter share, for instance, and that would be the analysis on top of the data point, more or less.
Sure, yeah. So that's the advantage of the elections database. You can zero into a specific district, you can zero into a specific candidate, you can zero into how much votes they had, the role that they were faced with. We don't go to the wards, but that's hopefully something we can push through in the next, if we have the time and funding to update the database.
And are those databases interlocked together? You mentioned, for instance, like the economics database, where you have sets looking at GDP per capita, and then you might have voter share. And are you able to then, draw those data sets together? Or is that a silly question where no, you can't combine these different data sets together? You mentioned 5 data sets. Do you treat them in isolation, or do you also combine them together?
You can combine them together in a study that you want. The databases are separate, but they're downloadable as spreadsheets, and then so if you have a variable and a column, then you can put them side by side.
And I think one of the things when you pursue maybe studying anything is to have like a hypothesis or a model that you're trying to validate. When it comes to the elections, what's the model that you have? What's the standard of elections that you're trying to measure against to see whether we're meeting the projections that we should be meeting or not? What's the standard of elections in your opinion that you'd like to see?
So the way I've approached it is, if we take violence in elections, for example, we're looking back at previous elections and seeing if they improve. If we're looking at the roll update, it's also previous elections and then improving. If we look at governance of the elections, then we look globally. If we look at voter turnout, voter participation, we compare PNG to other countries. If we look at population disparity, for example, we're looking back at the previous census, so for example, 2011 census, 2000 census, and seeing if they've improved or if they've worsened. So it's a different it's different aspects of the elections that have different approaches.
And I guess then looking at the reality of Papua New Guinea in terms of our GDP per capita, the level of education, the level of maybe rural-urban split, the standard of elections that we have in Papua New Guinea, is this what we should be expecting, or are we having maybe an elections shortfall given where we are as a country and as an economy?
We expect a lot of, the level of literacy is very low. The level of education, I think it's average 6 years of education. So we expect a lot of, we expect voters to not be informed, but we expect government to make up for that shortfall in, so if the previous elections were bad, if the recommendations were put forth, we expect governments to learn from their mistakes, to take on board a lot of the independent observer reports, and to make changes to really attempt to solve the issues that, they're all solvable if we have a government. And I'm really happy to talk to TIPNG because I really support the work you do in voter awareness and candidate awareness and trying to push for women to be strengthened in their campaigning and strengthened to win. So I guess it's government working with independent organizations, NGOs, and with academics to really improve the lot that we have.
And TIPNG does put out these election observation reports, and we look at the standard of the conduct of the elections, and we evaluate, particularly in our reports, the conduct of polling. So that's when people go to a polling station and actually cast their vote. We don't look at, for instance, the campaign period or at the counting period, and that's done by maybe other institutions. Like historically ANU have done election observation for those particular processes. Are there any other election processes do you think we should be evaluating? Because you've looked at maybe some of those data sets. Are there parts of the elections, and you alluded to, for instance, formation of government political parties, that should also be part of that evaluation of the standard of elections? Is there anything that hasn't been looked at yet that should be part of that analysis?
Yeah, I think fragmentation of parliament, we've written blogs about it. We haven't published an actual paper on it. Hopefully we can get that to publish. We'd really like to look at DSIP funding and how that really relates to formation of governments and the strengthening of government coalitions when they face votes of no confidence. We'd also like to look at campaign funding. There's no regulation of campaign funding. There's no data that we can gather. So that's a good area of research. I think also women. There's a lot of research done on women, but there's not a lot of research done women being endorsed by parties and compared to women's chances when they run as independents. So those are areas of research which we sadly lack the data to, but we're hoping that we can get variables, indicators that we can measure and then probably publish on.
I guess the researchers' worst and most difficult challenge is absence of data. And you mentioned if you don't have census data, it's difficult to maybe get some of the other key socioeconomic data points for your studies.
It's all estimates. So.
It's all estimates. But unfortunately, the estimates lead to a political reality that we have to live with. As an objective measure of preparedness for the elections, a lot of Papua New Guineans and our listeners and viewers would know that we have elections starting on the 28th of April. And we've had very little in terms of actual preparatory work that's been done, and now we seem to be trying to get the elections on the road, as it were. How would we know if Papua New Guinea was adequately prepared for the conduct of the elections? What would be those key things that we could see and say, look, because of this we know that we are prepared for the elections?
Well, at this point, the role update is what we're all focused on, and it is the first step. If the role is compromised, then we know that the elections will be compromised, their integrity will be compromised. So looking at what Simon Sinai has been talking about
That's
in the
papers. PNG Electoral Commissioner.
The Electoral Commissioner. He said that there's about 6 million voters that will be registered, whereas we expect there to be 5 million according to the more conservative estimates. So For example, at UPNG, we use the NRI published provincial estimates. So we see that already as the role is compromised, and in that sense, a lot of the recommendations for the 2017 role were not taken into account. So, for example, the role should have been recreated instead of updated, and the role also should not have been updated at the provinces and at the local level governments and districts. It should be more centralized because there is less of a chance of capturing the role by strong candidates. So it's a lot of these, when we see the recommendations that a lot of our colleagues, researchers have put out, and they're not taken on board, we can then kind of predict what the elections will look like after the elections are conducted, after June.
Yeah, I guess that's an important metric to see how many recommendations are also taken up. I think, like you say, the role is maybe the biggest element that people are looking forward to. I think one of the things that people often forget is that elections are a 5-year exercise. They shouldn't be a few months before the conduct of the elections.
Sure.
And for TIPNG, we've obviously advocated also for more awareness in the interim, for registering of new voters, particularly in the last 5 years, and it's part of the role update process. But also some of the legislative and organizational reforms that should be taking place. After each election, we know that the Electoral Commission submits a report to Parliament about conduct of the elections and also recommendations for actions, and those are other recommendations that can be looked at to see whether they've been implemented, because then that also indicates preparedness for the coming elections. But given all of that and given what we've discussed, if you had to look at one big challenge that you think is now the obstacle, is it the role update, or is it something else that you think will hamper the successful conduct of this 2022 elections?
I think if I were to point to three, I'd say the security of the elections. In 2017, there were 10,500 security personnel. There'll be 10,000 this year, but voters have gone up by 1 million voters, right, or at least 800,000 according to the Electoral Commission. So that's first of all, right. Security is not adequate. The role update is compromised, so that's the second issue. And then counting booths, right. We've got COVID-19. We've got a very low vaccination rate. We've got we know the campaign period will be there'll be high people concentration, and then at the counting booths as well, we don't know if COVID-19 protocols will be adhered to. So it's if it's COVID-19 role update, if it's security, if these can be adequately addressed, then I think we'll have a better election than what we're looking at will be the outcomes of this election.
You mentioned COVID-19, and I guess that's a new development that wasn't there since the last election, 2017. And it's also unique in that it's a global challenge, and I guess other democracies within our region and also externally have faced similar challenge of conducting democratic elections during a time of COVID-19. And you mentioned the vaccination rates. That might be a global challenge that's shared by a number of countries. Are there any particular unique challenges that you foresee for Papua New Guinea in terms of our demographic makeup or cultural context that makes it more difficult to deliver elections?
Yes, so a few of our former students have written blogs about this, and colleagues. The vaccine hesitancy is very high in PNG. I think it's from what I've seen, it's a demographic breakup. The older people are more worried about the religious implications of vaccine uptake. The younger people are more concerned with the health implications of the vaccine. But really, as it relates to the elections, if it's low vaccination rates, if it's high people concentration, then we're looking at a fifth or a sixth COVID surge after the elections. So that's what I really think government should be concerned about.
It's important. We often just focus on the elections and forget the long-term effects after the elections, and COVID-19 obviously is one, and given Papua New Guinea's unique vaccine hesitancy, and that's a key consideration. In terms of the approach that you've taken, and I think our viewers and listeners would see, it's very much in terms of the data and the data-driven approach to analysis. Often when it comes to political science analysis of the issues in Papua New Guinea, they're focused on the cultural aspects or in terms of the legal aspects. How do economists approach elections? You're an economist by profession. Do you have a different set of tools that you apply when you look at the conduct of elections?
Yeah, I think I think we approach it more quantitatively. I think we're more interested in averages, in ranges, in outliers, as you said before. I think we're interested more in if the data is available, then we can make informed decisions. If the data is not available, then the difference between me and a political scientist is I see the political scientist more or less guessing or applying it to a case study where the case study cannot be applied generally to the nation. So I guess. And then my focus is more on government funding. So funding of the elections, that's very narrow, but more government funding to the districts in terms of health grants, provincial grants, education grants, DSIP funding, service improvement program funding in general, and really the Ombudsman Commission's role in actually holding those things to account. So it's really funding for me, and the political economy aspect of the elections.
I think as we come towards the end of this podcast episode and looking at that response, I think one of the things where you have a data-driven approach, often you might find that it has less of a flexibility for predicting the unpredictable. Where you have a trend, it's easier to project if it's steady in terms of the data coming in. Would you say the elections in PNG from an economist's point of view are predictable, or is there often wide changes in any given electoral cycle in terms of the conduct of elections, or does it follow a very clear trajectory?
It does. The outlier was the 2002 elections, where there was high roll inflation. So roll inflation is voters exceeding estimated voters, registered voters exceeding estimated voters. Those high candidate numbers, high number of parties, high number of powerful parties. But apart from that, yes, we can see that the trends in terms of voter participation, we know that it's high in the highlands, low in the islands, pretty level in the Momase and southern region. And we know that election disputes, petitions will be high as well. High candidate numbers, high MP turnover rates, very low winner vote shares. So across those aspects of the election, that since 1977 at least, it's been a trend that hasn't changed.
Yeah. And given that predictable nature of, I guess, things that might be bad getting worse, if I can put it that way, what are some of the interventions that can be taken, given that we know, for instance, these things are likely? Where is that entry point, given that the data shows that we'll be here in 5 years' time? I know everyone's focused on the 2022 elections. Are there any reasonable steps that an economist would take in the next 5 years for the next electoral cycle?
Well, I'd start straight after the 2022 elections, recreate the role, start to index a lot of the funding from the PNG government to the Electoral Commission in terms of inflation, really look back at the problems in the last election and try to improve them in terms of voter participation, in terms of security, in terms of violence, in terms of the courts intervening, speeding up the process of election petition reviews, in terms of actually government reviewing, getting them more honest. The Electoral Commission report, in my view, and I think it's shared by a lot of other of my colleagues, is very sanguine. It praises government for its efforts, not highlighting a lot of the problems in depth. And so we'd like to hold government more accountable and more honest in their appraisal of the elections, and really to take recommendations, like I said before, from independent observers, really take them seriously and to implement them.
And it's a long laundry list of things that needs to be improved. If you had to sequence them, and I think you gave us a list of 3 things that you're particularly concerned about in the lead up to the 2022 elections. That's the security, the roll update process, COVID-19 and its impact. Are those still the same 3 things after the elections? What are the 3 most immediate steps that you would recommend being taken out of the list of items that you just outlined?
For the 2027?
For the next electoral period preparation, so 2022 to 2027.
So we'd really like the census to be conducted in 2024. If it's conducted, then the role can be recreated. And if the role is more, on top of a credible census, there'll be a credible role. And then we can then, so another thing that would be addressed properly would be malapportionment of electorates. Right? So we get more electorates, get them more population, get population parity, get them more equal by population, and then we have limit the number of candidates, that's a personal view, but and then strengthen voter awareness. And I guess the next 2027 elections will be better run.
Yeah, that's a long, a
It's
specific
another long-
list of
sorry,
things,
Yes.
but it is also some things that we didn't discuss in this episode. And
Sure.
I'd invite listeners and viewers, if you're interested in the Electoral Boundaries Commission, and that's the EBC that was mentioned by Maho, to also have a look at some of the articles that he was put out, particularly to the end of last year, about that particular agency's or particular body's responsibilities and the reports that they're putting out.
Sure.
We've had news media reports that it might be tabled in Parliament, and then this would be another issue looking at, again, what you mentioned, the electorates that we have in Papua New Guinea and the composition of the government. I think maybe to end off on a hopeful note, what are some of the resources that you would say you would like our listeners and viewers to look up and use? You mentioned some of the 5 data sets. Are there any other tools that can be used as they prepare to be more informed voters for these elections and in future?
Yes, so the elections database, the MP database, but more really, if someone wants to read, the Development Policy Center has a blog site with an archive of all the elections blogs that have gone back to, I think, when it started in 2015. And then we have long-form research pieces, discussion papers, and journal articles that are freely accessible online. And it covers a lot of the history of PNG, covers a lot of academic in-depth analysis on the elections. And because it's freely accessible, really people with access to the internet should be able to read and should be able to be more informed.
Excellent. We'll probably get those links off of you and also put them on the show notes so people can have access to that. And as we end, I ask the question we often ask to our guests. Given the difficult context and we're working in and the rights that we're trying to protect of citizens, some of the data points to some of the things we should expect. What inspires you to keep on doing this work and being vocal about the things that we should see to improve our country? What is it that drives you?
Well, I'm not going to leave or go anywhere. This is the country I was born in, probably will die here. So I see that as a responsibility for myself, where I'm placed with the tools God's blessed me with, to really try to make a difference, however small my voice may be. Try to write about it, and hopefully if people listen, if government listens, then we've at least made some headway in solving the issues that are at hand.
Thank you so much, Maho, and thank you for coming on the TIPNG VoteCast to share insights about the electoral preparations, how to evaluate the elections, and some of the things that we should be looking out for if we want to have free, fair, and safe elections in Papua New Guinea in the future. This is the TIPNG VoteCast, brought to you by Transparency International Papua New Guinea. We invite you to join us for future episodes, and thank you so much, Maho, for joining us.
Thank you.